Hello and welcome to the KURE Lab. I'm your host, Andrew Blow. It is a real thrill to be welcoming you to our inaugural episode. We're going to be talking about a lot of really interesting stuff here in the KURE Lab. We're going to be talking about health. We're going to be talking about wellness, about inflammatory disease. We're going to be talking about sport and performance, perhaps especially sport and performance. And yes, we're going to be talking about a brand new product, a one-of-one product, an extraordinary product that I truly believe is going to change the worlds of performance and sporting recovery absolutely on their heads. And a product that shows extraordinary potential in a much wider range of areas too, in terms of health and wellness. The product is KURE Oxygen Water. Now, it's an oxygen supplement, and I can say with some certainty, with a lot of confidence, that this is a one-of-one product. There is no product quite like this anywhere in the world. My brilliant colleagues have been able to successfully stabilise negatively buoyant oxygen nanobubbles in bottled water. Look, it sounds like a mouthful. It's a major technological breakthrough, though, and I'm sure that very soon you will understand completely what I'm talking about. Now, I want to preface this entire podcast by making it very clear. I'm not a doctor. This isn't health advice. I can say from experience, this water makes a huge difference to me when I drink it, but I really want to be upfront about that. But there is some hard science behind KURE now too, and we're going to be talking about science a lot. Okay, our first guest is a registered dietitian with over 20 years experience in clinical nutrition, scientific research, and sports performance optimization in athletes. He is the lead dietitian at King Edward VII Hospital in London and owner of Miller Health, a men's health and performance clinic. This gentleman has trained in multiple fields of nutrition, including functional medicine, naturopathy, and quantum biology, and is a huge advocate for the benefits of safe, functional foods, including oxygen water. He's been involved in a dozen or so clinical trials of consequence. Rick Miller, welcome to the KURE Lab. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Andrew. And what an introduction. How can one not blush almost when you hear something like that said about you? It's, it's a little bit much, but thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's very good to have you. And the blush is coming through on your olive skin very nicely there, mate, for what it's worth.
Thanks.
You know, what we're looking to do here really kind of lends itself so well to your experience. So I'm kind of keen to rip in and get cracking. Look, why don't we kind of start at first principles? Because I think that's often a really good place to start, especially when we're talking about something that is quite novel, but also really taps into some emerging science that is coming out from all across the world at the moment. So look, why don't we start with first principles? Let's outline why oxygen is so important to life. How does our oxygen interact with our bodies, and how does that keep us healthy, Rick?
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. Without understanding the first principles around oxygen, you can't understand the amazing benefits of the product we're going to be talking about later. Let's talk about that in general. So oxygen is something that usually most people don't really think about because obviously we breathe all the time and, we don't really pay much attention to it. But oxygen had a very crucial role in all life on this planet. So let's go back a few billion years to the early life of the Earth. Basically, it's understood through scientific research that the early Earth, around sort of 3 billion years ago, had very little oxygen on it. And basically all life that we saw in the sort of early Earth was what we call anaerobic. Basically, it lived without oxygen. And it used processes like fermentation, which we'll talk about later when we start to talk about health, to create energy. Then, as often happens in science, we start to create these very interesting terms to explain what's happened. And something called the Great Oxygenation Event happened around 2.4 billion years ago. And what that did was it allowed certain types of bacteria called cyanobacteria to begin the process of photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is something that, again, many people will remember from their school days. Mm-hmm. Again, that's plant life turning light into energy, basically, and in the process creating oxygen. And what they did, obviously, in this process of photosynthesis is they produced tons of oxygen, which then started to get into the early Earth's atmosphere. And that led obviously to an oxygen rich environment. So coming up to the sort of levels of oxygen that we now have in the atmosphere today, which is around 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. What did that actually do? So the increase in oxygen that we saw with early life on this planet allowed for the evolution of much more complex, energy demanding aerobic organisms. So organisms that could survive with oxygen. And that paved the way for multicellular life. So this is crucial to understand, that oxygen is so important to all life on this planet. But let's turn our attention now to away from bacteria to human beings, because that's obviously what we're interested in
It's a
talking
fine
about
line
today.
sometimes, though, Rick.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But I think the sort of top 5 areas that oxygen really will make sense to most people with is the following, really. So again, turning our attention back to our school days, another thing that we'll possibly remember from biology lessons is something called cellular respiration. So you might remember a weird equation being put on the board by a biology teacher. Oxygen plus glucose does something weird in a cell, and it produces carbon dioxide, plus energy plus water. And that's something that you have to memorize, and you don't know why you're memorizing it, but it's something important. But basically, this fundamental equation is something called aerobic respiration. So in the presence of oxygen, certain cells in the body are able to produce this energy currency called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. And that's sometimes termed the energy currency of the body. And without this process, basically cells die and they don't work properly. And when we have a deficit of energy, which obviously is helped along by oxygen availability, then we also have the presence of certain diseases that can form as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later and why that can happen. So that's the first thing, really, is that oxygen is fundamental to the process of making energy efficiently. The next thing as well that most people might know about is brain function. So the brain actually uses about 1/5 of all the oxygen that we take in every day just by breathing. So about 20% of all the oxygen you're breathing in is being used by the brain. And again, some conditions where we get brain damage and a lack of oxygen gets to the brain, like a stroke, for instance, we see the devastating effects that has on brain function. So it just shows how important oxygen and oxygen availability is to the brain. And then the other areas that people, again, might be aware of are things like muscle function. Now, we're going to talk about sports performance a little bit later, I'm sure, in the episode together. But again, as we start to do exercise, oxygen is crucial to be able to do performance for a long period of time. Again, you're breathing harder, and the reason you're doing that is because you're trying to get oxygen to your muscles to drive cellular respiration so that you can tap into all that stored goodness of fuels in your body to then actually power the muscles to do the intense activity. And obviously, when there's a lack of oxygen available, that's when that burn sets in, because lactate starts to accumulate in the muscle, and we start to get a lack of performance in the muscle tissue. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the last couple of things I want to mention as well in terms of human physiology is then oxygen transport around the body. Obviously, the ability to move oxygen is dependent on hemoglobin, which is a fundamental compound that's found in red blood cells. And again, that binds to oxygen in the lungs, and it carries it to the different tissues of the body and basically drops it off where it's needed. And then the last one is the immune response. A lot of people don't know this, but actually the immune system is highly dependent on oxygen. In fact, they not only need the energy that the oxygen helps to provide, obviously through cellular respiration, but actually the immune system actually uses oxygen to fight infections, because when oxygen is provided in very, very high concentrations in a burst, it can actually kill certain pathogens and infections. So oxygen is used at every single level of human physiology. That's why it's so important. And then the question then that arises is, well, what happens when we don't have enough of it? So I obviously mentioned what can happen with a brain injury, but a general lack of oxygen is known as hypoxia. So hypo meaning less, and so hypoxia meaning a lack of oxygen. And if you have low oxygen levels in any sort of tissue, you basically get tissue damage, because that cellular respiration doesn't work properly. So you get tissue dysfunction, it affects areas like the heart, the brain, the lungs, but basically every tissue starts to degrade over time with a lack of oxygen. And then the next question that probably arises, well, okay, if low oxygen is bad, then perhaps adding more oxygen is good. And then that naturally turns our attention to things like oxygen therapies and providing more oxygen to the body, things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which we can certainly talk about as well.
Yeah, look, it's fascinating stuff. One of my heroes at the moment is Gary Brecker, and one of the quotes that I heard from him recently is, "The presence of oxygen in the body is the absence of disease," and that was really pithy, and that really, really stuck with me. But one of the things that really seems clear to me, especially after conversations with you and with others, is that too much oxygen, that's not good. Too little oxygen, as you just kind of indicated there, well, that's not good either.
No.
But just a little bit more oxygen, well, that's magic.
Yes.
And as you kind of indicated, we see a lot online about the benefits of additional oxygen, like hyperbaric chambers. What's the evidence of more oxygen being beneficial to health? I mean, is this an established set of science now? And what's it been linked to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love your analogy there. I like to call it the Goldilocks zone. The right amount of oxygen is just perfect for health all around. But yeah, I mean, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or HBOT as it's known, is an established medical intervention. We tend to hear a lot about it through kind of biohacking groups and people doing going into these chambers, and athletes sitting in them and things like that. But actually, hyperbaric oxygen therapy has been used for quite a number of decades, and it's used in specific clinical conditions. So I'll talk about those in a second. So let's explain how it even works, basically. So hyperbaric oxygen therapy is basically the process of delivering pure oxygen to the body at much higher pressures than normal atmospheric pressure. So you need a special chamber to do this because you're trying to increase the pressure of this particular gas which we're trying to accumulate in our body, which is oxygen. Now, the important thing to remember when you increase the pressure, or what's known in physics as the partial pressure of oxygen, it becomes more soluble in whatever solution it's next to. So in the case of human beings, because we're composed of so much water, that means that whatever oxygen we breathe in through a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, it's going to dissolve more readily in the water of our body, basically, or more importantly, our bloodstream, which is the plasma. That's the liquid portion of our blood. And that's really important because you basically increase the amount of oxygen that's available, or free oxygen that's available in the plasma. And that means that whatever was being carried in the hemoglobin before, you've now just got like an extra amount, to deliver to the tissues. And so in doing so, by enhancing that tissue oxygenation, you're able to improve a number of different things. So, for instance, areas of the body which had poor oxygen delivery. So, for instance, let's talk about the joints. So the tendons and the ligaments are actually poorly vascularized, so they don't have a very good blood supply. That means that when you damage a tendon, it takes a very long time to heal. In fact, it takes longer than, for instance, if you tore a muscle. You'd think that, oh my goodness, if I ripped my pec, it would take far longer than if I damaged my tendon. But actually it's the other way around, because the pec has got plenty of vascularization. It can heal much faster. And so this is quite important in the context of hyperbaric chambers, because if you can get more oxygen there, if you injure yourself, you can speed up the process of recovery much faster. And so a lot of the clinical evidence is around lots of different conditions like that. So for instance, we've got medical evidence around collagen production. So much more oxygen levels increasing the synthesis of collagen, which is a key protein in many different tissues of the body. And lots of people are, especially in the anti-aging community, are trying to increase collagen production because, again, it helps with a more youthful appearance and plumping up tissues and looking younger, basically. But collagen is obviously important in wound healing, because collagen is used as a connective tissue. So this is very important, as I said, in things like injuries as well. You also get more stem cell activation as a result of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So again, stem cells are very important for tissue differentiation. Stem cells are basically the starting point for every cell in the body. And so if you can get more of them, again, you've got a bit of a fountain of youth at your disposal. You can start to really repair tissues that maybe couldn't have been done before. When you've got more oxygen available, cells basically feel a lot happier. So you start to turn down the inflammatory response in the body. And so one thing that we see as well with hyperbaric oxygen therapy is with inflammatory related conditions, both from an immune inflammatory response and also a local tissue inflammatory response. So I'm thinking, so if I was to throw some conditions out, things like rheumatoid arthritis or Crohn's disease, these are both conditions of chronic inflammation. Both are improved by hyperbaric oxygen therapy, significantly improved. And then also things like wound healing from surgery or infections. As I said, oxygen can have an infection fighting ability, and so hyperbaric oxygen therapy has been shown to improve recovery from quite nasty infections, things like necrotizing fasciitis, which I would not wish anybody to have to experience, osteomyelitis, or even things like burns, necrosis, traumatic brain injuries as well. In fact, actually, traumatic brain injury is something I've got quite a lot of experience with, because I used to work principally as one of the lead dietitians for the Professional Jockeys Association in the UK. And most people don't know this, but traumatic brain injuries like concussions and likewise are very, very common in the sport of horse racing, because if you're racing on an animal that's going at 40 miles an hour and you come off, it's a very high chance of concussion. So it's very, very common. And hyperbaric oxygen therapy is sometimes used with these professional riders to help recover from these particular therapies. And that was the first time I actually saw it being used in athletic performance.
Amazing.
So it's an amazing therapy, and there's huge amounts of evidence that more oxygen is very good for lots of different conditions. But there are some drawbacks.
Yeah, so I'd like to. So let me just. So I don't mean to cut you off, and I'd like to come back to some of the things that you've raised.
Sure.
I'd like to talk about Crohn's and colitis in just a bit, because I think there's a real opportunity to deep dive into that a bit more. The tendinopathy and tendinitis side of things, I think, is really, really fascinating, and as you say, there's a huge body of evidence to support the indication for treatments like hyperbaric chambers for conditions like this. CTE, I mean, that's we're hearing so much about this these days, and the potential of oxygen to play such an important role there, I think, is really, really worth exploring. You touched on blood flow just a moment ago, and I think that that is potentially something we could dedicate a whole episode to.
Yes.
I'm not suggesting we dedicate this whole episode to it, but I would like to come back to that and talk about it, not just for its implications for sport and performance, but also for its implications for health, from a much broader perspective. But you mentioned hyperbaric chambers, and we do know that lots of people have great experiences with hyperbaric chambers. But Rick, they're super expensive. I was doing some Googling just the other day. I was having a look around, and you're looking at about $700 for a 90-minute session. And sure, you may get a massive surge of oxygen into your system, but it's out of your system a short time later. And without kind of jumping straight to the conclusion here, the way I like to think about KURE is like walking around with your own hyperbaric chamber. It's like walking around with the ability to continually top up your oxygen levels in a way that is not cost prohibitive, but also really is effective at delivering high volumes of oxygen into your body. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
I think it is. And I think some people are probably thinking, I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical, gentlemen. I'm going to have to see a bit more evidence. And I'd be happy to provide that. I would say, as an additional point, I absolutely agree. I think hyperbaric therapy is wonderful. I do feel it's an option really only for for the privileged or for, the professional athletes or people who can basically buy one. I have seen them. You can purchase a home hyperbaric tent for about, and I've only got this in pounds, sadly, £18,000 I saw.
Is that all?
Pocket change for some. Maybe a Christmas present for me one day. I hope my wife is listening.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, it's just not really an option for most people. And also, there are risks associated with hyperbaric oxygen because you're going into a pressurized, tube, basically. So going under pressure carries risks associated with it, particularly to tissues and organs that are sensitive to changes in pressure, things like the ears. There's something that called barotrauma, which again, people who do, go up to altitude or do diving are very well aware of. It can damage your eardrums.
Sure.
It can also damage other small tissues like the eyes. It can cause seizures in some people and even hypoglycemia in some people, actually, because of the amazing effect that oxygen has on reducing blood glucose. So there are some risks. They are quite small, but they're worth mentioning because they are there. So not really an option for most people. But then let's talk about oxygen that's been dissolved in water, because this is really, really, I think, as you say, it is like carrying around a HBOT device with you all the time.
Yeah.
So,
but just before you get into that, Rick, can I just call out the elephant in the room?
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on this just a moment ago. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, oxygenated water, isn't that just a gimmick? I mean, is it actually really possible to get more oxygen into water?
Yeah, exactly. Of course. Like I say, there's probably plenty of skeptics out there thinking, what a lot of nonsense, and they're about to switch off now. But I implore you, please just hang on in there. So obviously, most people have only come across extra oxygen in their water if they keep like fish, or they have like any other form of aquaculture. They know that they've got to bubble water into their water to keep their fish happy in there. But otherwise, people don't really think about oxygen that's in the water. So let's just dive into that for a second. Again, go back to first principles. So obviously oxygen that's in water, again, let's go back to our chemistry, is H2O. So you've got two hydrogen molecules bound to an oxygen molecule. And that is the form that oxygen is in water principally. So it's not free oxygen. But there is a proportion of what we call dissolved oxygen, which is what we call free oxygen, which is available in the water. And it is in different amounts depending on the water itself and where it is. And I think this is really important because as a dietitian, I tend to practice from what I would call ancestral principles. So I'm very interested in the way that human beings have existed in the past and the sorts of things they used to do and how that affected their health from a chronic disease perspective. And this is really interesting in the context of water because early human beings, in order to have survived, you needed to be next to a source of water because obviously you can survive for quite a long time without food, but without water, you die pretty quickly. So human beings would have had to have been near a spring, effectively, or some sort of running water that was clean and that was free flowing so that they could always get a natural supply of water. Now, what's really interesting about spring water and cold, free-flowing water, like from, say, a waterfall or somewhere like that, is that it has more dissolved oxygen in it, for a start, than something like seawater or warmer water that you might find that's been stagnant in a warmer climate. And because it's free-flowing as well, that water is able to be aerated more easily because it's constantly being exposed to the air as well. So it's got, because of the flow rate and because of the temperature, it's cold, and because of the free-flowing nature of it, you have a higher concentration of oxygen. So humans in the past basically used to drink much higher oxygenated water than we do now, because when we compare natural water sources versus, say, tap water that you would get, or municipal water, as it's sometimes known across the world, it has a much lower concentration of free oxygen in it. And the way that's measured is in a metric called milligrams per litre, basically. And this is something that's measured by water quality companies, because they are obviously interested in the amount of oxygen that's available in the water, because it affects the growth of different bacteria species, different plant species like algae. So this is an important thing to consider, and it can affect obviously pollution levels as well. So that's a very interesting place to start off with, is that in the past we would have drunk higher oxygenated water anyway, and so human beings had a much better starting point, I believe, than we do now. So what is special about KURE water? So there is oxygenated water is something that's been done for a while. As I said, people have used oxygen to help keep their fish alive, and to obviously we add sometimes extra water to normal tap water as well for various reasons. But what typically happens is that when you add extra oxygen to just plain water, because of the size of the bubbles that are being put in, and again, if you remember when we talked about hyperbaric chambers, when you increase the pressure of a gas, it dissolves more easily into the water. The problem is those bubbles are pretty big of the oxygen. And so what happens is they just float back to the surface and they come straight out. And so there is a lot of popularity around these sort of oxygenating water devices and hydrogen devices as well. And I think they're great. They've got some amazing benefits of getting these different gases into your body. But the problem is you've got to consume them straight away, because the moment that gas is in the water, it's coming straight out, basically, because the gas is just floating towards the atmosphere. So again, so the skeptic in the room might be thinking, well, how do you keep the oxygen in there, basically? And so what KURE have done, which is something that's truly brilliant when I first came across it, and I was familiar with sort of, as I said, oxygen therapies before I met the amazing people at KURE, is that they have a specialist method that they use, and this is all freely available through their website as well. This isn't hidden proprietary information. They found a method of actually dissolving nano bubbles of oxygen into spring water, which they get from their Cornish site in the UK. I guess it's natural, clean, naturally higher in oxygen anyway, water, and then they're adding more dissolved oxygen into the water.
I hate to cut you off. I know you're the expert, but I can actually tell you categorically that the oxygen content in KURE is actually 120.25 milligrams of dissolved oxygen per litre. We're looking at 10 times more oxygen. And that is why KURE is actually able to come out here and publicly say that KURE has 10 times more oxygen than any other drinking water without running afoul of your advertising regulator. So you'll see it on the side of the bottle, 10 times more oxygen than any other water. And look, I really love the way that you put that, because your lungs do a fantastic job, don't they, Rick? And and thank God for our lungs, but they don't do a 100% perfect job. They're not 100% efficient, and they're not even perfect the day we're born, let alone after all of the stress that we put them through over the course of a lifetime. So as an approach to potentially getting more oxygen in the body, I mean, surely that this is something that might be of some considerable value.
Of course, and I think what's interesting is obviously these are different routes for getting oxygen into the body. Obviously, the lungs do it through the the trachea and through the airways, effectively the air pipes going into our body, and then that gets into the hemoglobin, which we've talked about. This is a different method of getting oxygen into the body, which has its own unique benefits. But just to kind of finish off the amazing story about KURE, because I just love talking about this amazing technology, is just when you dissolve this in, because again, the skeptics in there are thinking, okay, so there's more oxygen in there, but really how is it actually in there? So the interesting thing with this nanobubble technology is that when you push it down to such a small size, so below the 100 nanometer range, something amazing happens to the oxygen bubbles. So as I said before, when they're large, they just float to the surface and they escape into the atmosphere. But when they get so small, what they do is it changes the electrical tension around the bubble. And this is known as something called the zeta potential, which we're going to come back to later. And again, zeta potential is something that is not pseudoscience. It is fully accredited, and it's a very important process, particularly in what we call hemodynamics. So basically the flow of blood, and you talked about that before, and we will absolutely come back to that. But what zeta potential does is it creates an electrical charge, a tension on the bubble surface, and that is negative. It makes it completely negative. So the bubbles basically repel each other, and that spreads the bubbles out in the bottle. It stops them sort of coalescing and creating big bubbles, and so the water remains highly oxygenated and the gas never escapes. And KURE have tested this under several conditions in research papers which have been published, showing that you can leave the bottle open and it doesn't change in terms of its oxygen content. So you can be assured that every bottle that you're drinking, you're getting the amount of oxygen that Andrew was mentioning, which is very important when people are thinking, I'm going to invest in this. You want to be sure that you're getting that into your body, which is something that, again, we'll come on to when we talk about performance.
Yes.
That's something that the supplement industry cannot do. Quite often, it's quite a shady industry, which makes a lot of promises and delivers on very little. So I think this is something that, again, is very refreshing as a clinician to see is a natural product which is delivering on what it says that it's going to do.
It's extraordinary. It really is. And, I think you sum it up so beautifully. Because the nanobubbles are negatively buoyant, the only way to actually get them out of the bottle is to drink the stuff. And we can talk about, in a second, we can talk about some of the science that we've got that shows proof positive, if you ask me, that not only does every single bottle of KURE contain super high volumes of bioavailable oxygen, but that oxygen does indeed make its way into your system and all the way to your skin. But we'll come back to that in just a second. As a business, Rick, as you know, we kind of don't make a business of, or a practice of, kind of tearing down our competitors. There are some great brands out there, some great entrepreneurs doing some absolutely fantastic work, really investing in science. But as you touch on, the problem is this: in every other oxygenated water, so to speak, the oxygen inside the bottle obviously weighs less than the H2O molecule. And so when you unscrew the lid, the oxygen simply gasses off and immediately leaves the bottle, which means that you actually aren't getting access to the oxygen that may or may not be there in the first place. With KURE, the oxygen nanobubbles are, of course, stabilised and negatively buoyant, so they do make their way into the body. Yes. But what then? What's the difference between how KURE is absorbed and the way other oxygenated water is potentially absorbed? And what does that actually mean for the human body?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, Andrew, because as we talk about later when we start to go through some of the research that's been done, there has, in complete, openness and frankness, there has been some inconsistency in the findings, as you often find in science, and that's okay. But I think that's partially down to the products that were being used, because as you say, if you open a bottle and then immediately the percentage of oxygen has declined, as you're doing your experiment, whatever it is, performance trial, and your participants drinking and they're losing oxygen from the water as they're drinking it, well, is it really then a fair assessment of the product on human physiology and performance? Yes. I would say no, not really. And I think this is partially why there's been some inconsistent literature before. And actually, I think some quite poor accusations of oxygenated water in general on human physiology and performance by, I would say, some very eminent and respected people, and especially in the sports science field, which I looked up to for a long time, actually, as a clinician when I was finishing my research. But you mentioned, what's the difference and how does it work? So, as I said before, when you breathe, obviously, oxygen is entering into your body via the trachea and going into the lungs, and then coming out via the hemoglobin into the tissues, into the circulation. So the way that oxygen in water would get into your body is through A few different routes, and some of these have been fully tested in a clinical trial, and I'll explain that in a second. And some of them are more sort of hypothetical, which I think that we just need to test these things and see what's been happening. We have the results that the oxygen does reach the circulation. We just need to show how it gets there, basically. When you drink the water, let's say it's a bottle of KURE, you crack it open and you start to enjoy its lovely, refreshing taste. There are a couple of different routes straight away that oxygen can enter your body. Because of the nano bubble technology, the ability for that oxygen to be absorbed in the water straight across a membrane is much easier than it would be for regular oxygen in water, because of that charge that we talked about before, that zeta potential. The zeta potential actually allows for a better absorption across tissues, and this is why when we talk later about maybe some of the skin effects that we've seen with KURE water, and the ability for it to oxygenate skin as well later and actually increase the oxygen concentration in skin. This is a very important factor in terms of the absorption, and this is why KURE is different to other oxygenated forms of water. It can actually get across tissues very, very fast, at a significantly faster rate. So as you drink it, there's one way it can go straight into the body, which would be sublingually, so basically under the tongue. That is a direct access into the systemic circulation, so that's one way it could go in straight away. As it's traveling down your esophagus, so your food pipe, basically, that's also a very vascularized area of the body. There's plenty of blood there. There's actually obviously the vena cava, which is one of the main blood vessels going from the heart. It's also there right next to it as well. It can also absorb across there. So it hasn't even reached the gut, and it's already being absorbed very likely into the bloodstream. So this is my postulation about how it's getting in so quickly.
Yep.
Then it reaches the small intestine after it's gone through the stomach. Now, one piece of research that was quite pivotal and I would say groundbreaking in terms of showing that this water really does allow more oxygen to get into the body was actually shown by a Norwegian completely independent research group in 2020, so 5 years ago. And they did an MRI assessment of the gastric tract after consuming oxygenated water. Now, they didn't use nano bubble oxygenated water. They just used that plain old oxygenated water that probably came out of a fish tank, who knows. So this is even more impressive. And they looked at something called relaxometry, which again is probably something that I would say 99% of the audience have probably never heard of. But basically, this is a very important process that's used in medical imagery, and particularly MRIs, which are a form of way of scanning the body and looking at the insides of your body, particularly the condition of different tissues. So sometimes MRIs are used to look again for tissue damage. Maybe you've had an injury, you might do an MRI to see if that injury is very, very severe inside the body. Well, what it can also do is it can show how a tissue is changing its state in response to something that's changing the magnetic fields around tissues. Now, again, without getting into all the sort of the quantum physics around why that would work and why that happens, basically, the MRI scanner is able to detect the changes in the tissues along the gastric tract before the oxygen crosses it and afterwards when it reaches the circulation, because of the way it affects the hemoglobin molecules and the way it affects the tissue lining. And what they found in this Norwegian group is that it definitely does reach just by drinking this water, the oxygen does reach the systemic circulation. And they postulated that the way it increases oxygen levels is by increasing the activity of a particular transporter for water, which is called the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which again, some of you might have come across again in your biology days when you were talking about human physiology and anatomy, and you're talking about water retention and how the kidney works, basically, because we use drugs that affect this particular pump to affect kidney function, or people who've got kidney disease. If the oxygen is increasing the activity of this pump, because again it's helping with cellular activity, then it's going to draw more water across the membrane a lot faster. And this is one of the ways that it's been established that the gut, even though the gut is a low oxygen environment, it can actually absorb more oxygen just by giving it more to the lining of the gut. So that's the clinical evidence, and Rick's off the top of his head, hypothetical but very plausible explanation of how it could get in a bit faster as well.
Okay.
But there are obviously other things that oxygen does to the gut lining as well on top of
Yeah,
that.
and look, let's get back to that in just a second because I'm really interested to talk about that. And I know
Yes.
you've got a bit to say on that as well. But as you know, Rick, as part of my due diligence, I sent you a couple of research papers from 2015, mind you, that presume to debunk the very viability of oxygenated water. And they identified a few things that we've kind of touched on already, such as, the fact that when you take, the lid off, all of the oxygen gas is off. And one of the other things it found was that the gut itself was not designed to absorb high volumes of oxygen.
Yes.
How would you respond to that? I know you've touched on that, but I want you to
Yeah.
expand on that a bit more.
That is true. That is true. So it's not designed to have a lot of oxygen. But do remember, the gastric tract is basically, the human body is basically a bit like a donut. It's like it's got a hole going from one end all the way to the other. So it is exposed to oxygen. So air is coming in and out, and we all know this, intimately in many ways. So yes, whilst it's designed to be a low oxygen environment for very specific reasons, it doesn't mean that it lacks complete capacity to absorb oxygen, because the tissues, again, down there need oxygen. So if the commentators were correct in their assertion that extra oxygen could not be absorbed, then this Norwegian group would not have seen the results that they did. And they did very, very good, very clinically robust ways of establishing whether the oxygen does get across into the systemic circulation, and an MRI scanner is the absolute best way to do that. And they gave a very good mechanism, which is it's activating a known pump, which helps with water absorption, and it's pushing more into the system. But I can understand where they might be coming from, but might I offer something else that's also quite interesting, I think, around this area, which is that when you put more oxygen into the system of the gut, there are a few things that can happen. So one thing that we do know, and you mentioned this a bit earlier when you talked about Crohn's disease and colitis and these inflammatory bowel conditions, when we actually look at the microbiome makeup of individuals with those conditions. So again, people have heard about the gut microbiome, and the gut microbiome effectively is the genetic information of all the microorganism species that are living in the gut. So that's everything from viruses to fungi to bacteria, basically. It's the genetic information. So it's a bit like a forensic science in some ways, so like a crime scene, I like to call it. But what we do know from people with those conditions that are inflammatory is that there is a massive shift in the gut microbiome to a more anaerobic state. Okay. Now, remember, all the way back at the start, I said to you that life on this planet needed to move from an anaerobic state to an aerobic state. So the bacteria had to change in order for life to evolve. And when you can have too much of a bad thing, obviously, you do need some anaerobic bacteria in the gut, because they do some interesting things with regards to gut health. So they make certain compounds which are beneficial to us, like, for instance, short chain fatty acids. They make these compounds. But we do know that some of these species, like, for instance, Clostridium difficile, which is something that's very common in hospital-acquired infections, these are a strict anaerobe, and they are at a much higher level in individuals with Crohn's disease. Now, if you give these individuals, again, this is coming from research with hyperbaric oxygen. We don't have this research yet with direct clinical evidence, anyway, with using something like KURE water. But I would postulate the same effects would probably happen, and we do have anecdotal evidence that certainly that has happened. When you give more oxygen to these individuals, their condition calms down. Now, that's by probably two mechanisms. Number one, you're affecting the gut lining, so you're able to calm the inflammatory response in the gut by giving more oxygen to those tissues to reduce the cellular inflammation. But secondly, by putting more oxygen into the gut, by breathing it in, as I said, remember, we're a donut, oxygen's coming in to the gut no matter what you do. You're able to shift the balance of bacteria quite quickly by putting more oxygen in there, because you're going to allow those aerobic species to populate a little bit more and shift that balance across. So there is certainly, I see this in my practice, there's been a big increase in the number of people coming in with what they would call, small intestine bacterial overgrowth and dysbiosis and SIBO and SIFO and, extended bloating and all this sort of stuff. I mean, if you could improve that just by changing the water that you drink, on a daily basis, even if it was just one bottle a day, as we've seen the power of this stuff, we'll talk about in a minute. I mean, that's life-changing for some people. I mean, IBS alone, irritable bowel syndrome, affects a fifth of the world's population. I mean, it's billions of people.
So there's a lot of reason to believe, you're putting to us here today, that not only will you get the ultra-fast hydration benefits from drinking KURE, but the presence of oxygen in the gut, in the way that you've just described, potentially can provide profound benefits to people who are suffering from things like Crohn's and colitis.
Absolutely. And I think also, if we go by the gut brain, gut lung, gut eye, pick whatever axis you want, a sort of connection, as we're finding out throughout the research, if you improve that bacterial balance just by giving a little bit more oxygen, even temporarily, then a number of different conditions might well be affected likewise. Again, it might be mental health, it might be cardiac health, it might be brain health, it might be something else. But I think what's really profound for me, again, and I touched on this before, is that very infrequently do you see the ability to affect such a significant condition naturally at all in clinical environments. We either have to use very, very strong sort of humoral mediated therapies, so basically therapies that affect the immune system, and that's one mainstay of things like colitis and Crohn's disease management, and or we're using very strong anti-inflammatory medications, which again have their own side effects.
Yes.
Or if people are going down the natural therapy route, probiotics have a 60% failure rate in most cases, and all these other sort of herbal remedies, etc. They do have some evidence again, but mostly they're untested, and a lot of the industry is highly unregulated, and so you don't even know what you're getting and putting into your body. And then I worry about younger people doing this as well.
Sure.
Children and parents who are maybe doing what they think is the right thing for their children, giving them different supplements to help them with their tricky tummy, and it's maybe having long-lasting effects on them. And as a father myself of two beautiful children, I would be concerned, about putting something like that I didn't know was definitely going to help them at all and not have side effects.
I have 5 kids, Rick, so I completely understand and appreciate your concern. And look, that's one of the things that really does strike me about KURE. I mean, we talk about a lot about what's in the water, and what I really, really love about KURE is the purity of it. What we're talking about is literally hydrogen and oxygen. It is water in its purest form. But we should also talk potentially about what's not in the water, and you just touched on this, and we're talking about no additives, no emulsifiers, no preservatives. So it is a really, really pure approach with none of those hidden nasties that you just mentioned.
No, it's safe for everyone to consume. It's just water with added oxygen. And as I said, human beings were consuming water, not in the levels obviously that we get into KURE, but they were consuming water with much higher levels of oxygen in the past. And my professional opinion is that there can only be benefits for individuals from getting a bit more oxygen into their body, for sure, because it's established science.
Well, that's part 1 of our podcast with Rick Miller. Isn't he an interesting fellow? Please tune in for part 2, where we talk more about the science behind KURE.